Imagine a peace deal sitting right there on the table. Like, it gives you absolutely everything you want.
Right.
Your adversary just agrees to halt their most dangerous weapons program completely. And all you have to do is lift a few economic sanctions.
Sounds like a no-brainer, honestly.
Exactly. Now imagine vetoing that deal. And by doing so, you actually accidentally trigger the creation of this massive, heavily fortified nuclear infrastructure that basically terrifies the entire globe.
Yeah, which is, I mean, that's exactly what the United States did back in 2003.
It's wild. Or consider this one. How did massive regime-shaking domestic protests in Iran in 2009, like we're talking streets filled with fire, millions demanding change, how did that actually push Iran's supreme leader to the negotiating table with Barack Obama rather than making him, lash out?
It completely flips conventional geopolitical logic right on its head. Because we tend to view international relations through this very linear lens, right? Like you apply enough diplomatic or economic pressure, the target eventually just snaps and surrenders.
Right. Force equals break.
Yeah.
Which is comforting, I guess. But as we're going to uncover today, it is just totally wrong when it comes to the subject of today's deep dive.
Oh, absolutely wrong.
So for you listening, we are cracking open this extensive chapter today. It's titled The Nuclear Gambit, and it's from a massive source document called nuclear.pdf. And we're not just going to talk about, uranium and centrifuges.
Yeah, those are really just the literal nuts and bolts of the whole thing.
Exactly. We are looking at a 30-year geopolitical chess match. Our mission today is to understand how Iran's nuclear program became the gravitational center of its entire existence.
Yeah.
Like its domestic politics, its massive shadow economy, its proxy wars across the Middle East, literally everything revolves around the atom.
It does. And to really grasp the gravity of this, I mean, we can't start with the headlines of today. We actually have to trace the roots back to an era before the Islamic Republic even existed.
Wait, really?
Yeah, we have to look at the Pahlavi period. So under the Shah of Iran, way back in the 1970s.
Right. This was a detail on the source that completely reframed the whole timeline for me. Because the Shah started the nuclear program, and he actually did it with the blessing of the West for civilian energy purposes.
He did, yeah.
But the underlying geopolitical logic was already just deeply embedded there. Like, he explicitly noted that if small, rival Middle Eastern countries embarked on a path toward nuclearization, no matter how primitive or crude their technology was, Iran's quote-unquote national interest would dictate that it just had to follow suit to maintain regional hegemony.
Exactly. So the seed of this as an absolute national security imperative, that was planted long before the 1979 revolution even overthrew him.
Wow.
Yeah, so the Islamic Republic inherits that infrastructure. Yeah. But they also inherited a dramatically changed world. I mean, to understand the modern incarnation of the program, the absolute foundational text for Iran's current leadership isn't just religious ideology.
Which is what everyone assumes, right?
Right, but it's not. It is actually the profound trauma of the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s.
Yeah. I really want to spend some time here because the psychology of this is just critical. During that 8-year war, Saddam Hussein used chemical weapons against Iranian troops and civilians.
Horrific amounts of them.
Yeah, we are talking about mustard gas and nerve agents, and he used them with total impunity.
And the international silence was just deafening. I mean, the United Nations passed resolutions regarding the war, sure, but for a long time, they failed to explicitly condemn Iraq for utilizing weapons of mass destruction.
Because Western powers were quietly backing Iraq to contain the new Iranian revolution.
Exactly. They basically just looked the other way.
So if you put yourself in the shoes of the Iranian leadership at that exact moment, your soldiers are literally choking to death in trenches, the Geneva Conventions have apparently been suspended just for you, and the global community is just shrugging.
Right, and that realization struck them like a thunderbolt. They realized they were entirely, completely on their own.
Just totally isolated.
No international body, no superpower, and no legal framework was coming to save them. The laws of war just did not apply to Iranian blood, essentially. And this horrific realization birthed the concept that dominates their strategic thinking to this very day, a doctrine they call sacred defense.
Sacred defense.
Yeah.
It's a very evocative term. It kind of blends theological righteousness with, well, absolute geopolitical paranoia.
That's a great way to put it. It institutionalized the mindset that survival in a hostile world requires absolute self-reliance. So toward the end of the Iran-Iraq War, the leadership made this quiet but truly monumental decision. They restarted the nuclear program.
Right.
And initially, they framed it as a civilian energy endeavor. But the national security argument was the undeniable undercurrent. They needed the respect, the technological intimidation factor, and most importantly, the deterrence that they lacked when Saddam was gassing their cities.
And they weren't just tinkering in university labs either, right?
Correct.
The source notes, they actively sought out black market blueprints. Like in the 1990s, they extensively examined the paths taken by Pakistan and Libya.
Oh yeah, they went deep into the black market.
Commanders from the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, they actually visited Pakistan to discuss acquiring nuclear technology from the infamous AQ Khan proliferation network.
Which is wild to think about.
It is. The former Iranian president, Akbar Hashemi Rafsanjani, even documented in his memoirs that he discussed the nuclear program with Pakistan's Prime Minister Benazir Bhutto during her visit to Tehran.
Right, it was a highly secretive pursuit of capability. But it is crucial to recognize the initial intent here. The program wasn't conceived as an offensive weapon to conquer the Middle East or immediately destroy rivals. It was a desperate bid for an insurance policy.
Let me bring in an analogy here. It's like a homeowner who was violently burglarized and beaten while the local police basically just stood on the sidewalk and watched.
That's exactly the mindset.
So that homeowner decides they need to build an absolute fortress complete with electrified fences and a vault, and they don't care what the homeowners association or the law says. They will literally never trust the police again. But here's the flaw in that strategy that I want to ask you about. If this fortress was purely for defense, why keep it entirely secret until it was dramatically exposed to the world in 2002?
Well, because building the deterrent is actually the most vulnerable period of a nation's history. That 2002 exposure is a massive pivot point. An Iranian dissident group, the MEK, publicly revealed the existence of these massive secret nuclear facilities at Natanz and Iraq. And the timing could not possibly have been worse for Tehran.
Because the United States was literally massing troops next door to invade Iraq at that time.
Exactly. The atmosphere in Washington was fully mobilized for war in the Middle East. So the revelation of secret Iranian nuclear sites triggered an immediate international frenzy.
I can imagine.
From the perspective of the U.S. and its European allies, this anti-Western theocracy had secretly circumvented decades of containment. If they allowed that program to mature, it could give Iran a nuclear umbrella. And under that umbrella, Iran could vastly expand its support for proxy groups like Hezbollah and Hamas, which would heavily constrict Israel's ability to defend itself.
So, Ali Khamenei, the intensely security-conscious supreme leader in Iran, he sees the U.S. gearing up to depose Saddam Hussein, and suddenly, his own secret program is on the front page of the New York Times. He must have viewed this as a deliberate pretext to target Iran next.
Oh, absolutely. He was staring down a paradox of vulnerability. In 2002, Iran's nuclear program was suddenly exposed, which brought the immediate threat of devastating international pressure and potentially even a U.S. military invasion.
But the program wasn't actually advanced enough to serve as a real deterrent yet.
Precisely. They had painted a massive bullseye on their own backs, but they hadn't finished forging the shield.
That moment of sheer panic acts as a catalyst, right? It forces Iran's leadership into what the text describes as a bitter ideological civil war over how to just survive the impending crisis.
Yeah, it drew a sharp dividing line through the Iranian political elite that has basically defined the country for the last 2 decades. On one side, you had the reformists. They were led by the sitting president at the time, Mohammad Khatami. Their fundamental philosophy was engagement. They argued that the only way to mitigate the existential threat of an American invasion was to resolve the nuclear crisis through diplomacy, transparency, and negotiations with the West.
And their opponents. I'm assuming they did not want to negotiate.
Not at all. The hardliners, heavily backed by the IRGC, their argument was rooted purely in that sacred defense trauma we talked about.
Right, the never trust anyone mindset.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They believed any accommodation of the West was a display of weakness that would only invite more aggression. They wanted to dispense with all the diplomatic pleasantries, double down, and rapidly build out a full-fledged program with threshold military potential.
And the hardliners get a massive rhetorical boost from Washington just a few months later. President George W. Bush delivers his State of the Union address and lumps Iran into the axis of evil right alongside Iraq and North Korea.
Yep, the infamous speech.
Which is crazy because Khatami had actually tacitly cooperated with the U.S. in the initial invasion of Afghanistan to oust the Taliban. And his reward was being branded as part of an evil axis. That had to validate everything the IRGC was screaming about.
It was a devastating blow to the reformist credibility, honestly. Khamenei increasingly resisted the reformist arguments, stating repeatedly that the United States was fundamentally untrustworthy.
I mean, from his point of view, he had a point.
Right. Yet, despite the soaring rhetoric and the whole axis of evil label, the reformists still managed to orchestrate a diplomatic attempt.
Which brings us back to that mind-bending hook from the beginning of the deep dive. In 2003, Iran's negotiating team sat down with European powers, Britain, France, and Germany. And they actually struck a deal.
They did.
Iran agreed to halt its enrichment program entirely in exchange for the lifting of economic sanctions. A complete halt. It sounds like exactly what the international community was demanding.
On paper, yes.
But Washington swoops in and vetoes the deal in October 2003. I really need you to explain the logic here, because rejecting a halt to a nuclear program just seems like diplomatic malpractice.
So it comes down to a catastrophic miscalculation of leverage. The United States vetoed the agreement because, at that specific moment in 2003, they just did not view Iran's nascent nuclear program as a terrifying threat.
Wait, really?
Yeah, the infrastructure was still relatively small. Washington looked at the board and decided they didn't need to offer any concessions, especially not sanctions relief. The prevailing theory in the Bush administration was that they could simply demand Iran dismantle its entire program down to the last nut and bolt and offer absolutely nothing in return.
Just because the U.S. had just easily conquered Iraq next door, they assumed the sheer threat of American military might would force Iran to capitulate.
Precisely. The politicoscientist Kenneth Pollock famously called this the doctrine of bigger carrots and bigger sticks. But in reality, the U.S. was relying almost exclusively on the stick of implied regime change.
So let me trace the causality here, because this is wild. By refusing to accept a deal to halt a small nuclear program simply because it wasn't scary enough to warrant concessions, the U.S. essentially taught Iran a very dangerous lesson about how Washington operates.
Exactly.
Iran realized that a small program gets you zero leverage. If you want the United States to actually compromise and lift sanctions, you need to bring a massive, terrifying threat to the table. The U.S. basically incentivized the rapid expansion of the very thing they were trying to stop.
It is, honestly, one of the great historic backfires of modern diplomacy. Iran's rulers concluded that the 2003 resolution failed because their program was too primitive to command respect, so they adopted a highly sophisticated dual-track strategy.
Okay, what does that look like?
On the diplomatic front, they remained open to talks, keeping the international community engaged but perpetually dragging their feet. But on the physical front, they methodically expanded their nuclear infrastructure.
All while insisting it was strictly for peaceful civilian purposes. Khamenei even issued a religious decree, a fatwa, in 2003, explicitly banning the development, stockpiling, and use of nuclear weapons, declaring them incompatible with Islamic law.
Right, and that fatwa provided immense diplomatic cover.
Yeah.
It allowed them to claim they were just exercising their sovereign right to civilian nuclear technology under international law. But beneath that cover, the centrifuges just kept spinning, the cascades multiplied, and the stockpile of enriched uranium grew.
So they are carefully balancing this act, dragging out talks while building out the hardware. But in 2009, this delicate geopolitical dance is completely interrupted by a massive domestic earthquake. The streets of Tehran erupt.
The Green Movement.
Yeah.
Following the deeply disputed re-election of the hardline President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, literally millions of Iranians poured into the streets.
That was huge.
It really was. The scale of the popular anger, the organization, the deep-seated support for the reformist candidates, it completely shattered the regime's illusions.
Because up until that point, the leadership at the top had this halcyon view that they had the country completely under control. The Green Movement proved that they were basically sitting on a domestic volcano.
And this profound domestic vulnerability fundamentally altered their foreign policy calculus. The leadership realized that to survive the internal threat, to marshal their security forces and address the fallout from the Green Movement, they required stability abroad.
They couldn't fight a two-front war, basically.
Exactly. They could not afford to be fighting an escalating, potentially kinetic crisis with the West over the nuclear program while their own citizens were actively trying to tear down the regime.
Simultaneously, the chessboard changes on the American side. Barack Obama enters the White House, and he brings a fundamentally different strategic philosophy regarding Iran.
He did. Obama recognized that the constant threat of regime change was making a nuclear deal impossible. So he fundamentally altered the messaging.
How so?
Well, he began referring to the country by its official name, the Islamic Republic of Iran, in public addresses, which was a massive symbolic sign of respect that previous administrations had completely avoided. He also sent private, direct letters to Supreme Leader Khamenei, making it explicitly clear that the United States was not seeking to topple his government.
But let's be clear for the listener, Obama wasn't softening on the nuclear issue itself. Taking regime change off the table was a tactic to isolate the nuclear program so he could crush it with pressure.
Oh, exactly. Obama dramatically escalated the coercive measures targeting the nuclear infrastructure. He rallied European powers and the UN to implement severe, totally unprecedented economic sanctions. And crucially, he paired this economic strangulation with covert kinetic action.
Right.
This is the era of the Stuxnet cyber attack.
Stuxnet is fascinating because we tend to throw the word cyber attack around to mean like stealing data or crashing a website, but this wasn't data theft. Explain how this malware actually functioned in the physical world.
Stuxnet was the first truly recognized cyber-physical weapon. It was a highly sophisticated piece of malware, developed jointly by the US and Israel, designed specifically to target the Siemens programmable logic controllers, the PLCs that ran the centrifuges at Iran's Natanz facility.
And a centrifuge spins uranium gas at supersonic speeds to separate the isotopes, right? They're incredibly delicate machines.
Incredibly delicate. You breathe on them wrong and they break. What Stuxnet did was brilliant and just terrifying. Once it infected the system, it didn't just break the machines immediately.
That would be too obvious.
Right. It sat quietly and recorded the normal operating data of the plant. Then it subtly took control of the centrifuges, commanding the rotors to speed up to destructive frequencies and then slow down, warping the metal and tearing the machines apart from the inside.
And while it's destroying the machines, what are the human operators seeing in the control room?
That's the most insidious part. Stuxnet played back the recorded normal data to the operator's screens.
No way.
Yeah. It's like a bank heist movie where they loop the security camera footage so the guard sees an empty vault while the robbers are cleaning it out. The Iranian engineers watch their monitors showing everything operating perfectly, while in the centrifuge halls, their machines were inexplicably shattering.
That is wild.
It induced massive paranoia and set the program back significantly.
So you have Stuxnet physically wrecking the facilities. You have unprecedented global sanctions choking the economy. The containment cordon is tighter than it has ever been. Former President Rafsanjani actually warned Khamenei that America was applying the exact same playbook they used against Iraq in the 1990s. Weaken the country through isolation and sanctions until it is so degraded that a military intervention is basically just a mop-up operation.
The pressure was immense. But the crucial variable that actually opened the door to negotiations was Obama's reaction to the 2009 Green Movement protests. As millions of Iranians marched for democracy, Obama assiduously avoided intervening or aggressively championing their cause.
He took a brutal amount of criticism for that in the United States, I remember. Many argued he abandoned democratic protesters in their hour of need.
He did face intense criticism, but his calculation was rooted in stark realism. He didn't believe American rhetoric could alter the outcome on the ground in Tehran, and he feared that if the U.S. aggressively intervened, the Iranian regime would use it as an excuse to shut the door on any nuclear negotiations forever.
But how did that play out in Tehran? Did the regime see his inaction as weakness?
No, surprisingly, they saw it as a profound validation of his private letters. Unbeknownst to Obama's critics, his restraint during their moment of absolute maximum domestic vulnerability was the ultimate proof for Khamenei.
Wow, okay.
It demonstrated that Obama was actually serious about a transactional arms control deal, and that he truly was not trying to orchestrate the collapse of the Islamic Republic. That realization, which again was born from domestic survival instincts, pushed Khamenei to finally test the diplomatic waters.
And this sets the stage for the Muscat back channel. Khamenei reaches out to Oman's Sultan Qaboos, asking him to facilitate secret bilateral talks with the United States in Muscat in March 2013. These quiet meetings established the framework. And then the Iranian political landscape shifts once again.
Yes. In June 2013, Hassan Rouhani is elected president. Now, Rouhani is a critical figure here. He is a pragmatic, moderate, a close protege of Rafsanjani, and importantly, he was Iran's chief nuclear negotiator back in 2003 when they attempted that first deal with Europe.
Right, the guy who knows a file.
Exactly. He had literally published a book arguing that Iran's economy could only survive if the nuclear standoff was resolved through diplomacy.
The contrast in that election is almost cinematic. Rouhani's main opponent was Saeed Jalili. And Jalili is the archetype of the rigid hardliner. He is a wounded war veteran who lost part of his right leg in the Iran-Iraq War. He served as the chief nuclear negotiator under the provocative Ahmadinejad from 2007 to 2013. Jalili firmly believed that Iran should pursue its nuclear ambitions completely unimpeded, basically arguing that making concessions to the West was a total betrayal of the revolution.
Right. It presented the Iranian public with a very stark ideological choice. And Rouhani won comfortably in the first round.
People wanted relief.
Exactly. The mandate from the people was clear. They wanted engagement with the global economy over unending ideological resistance. So with Rouhani in office, the formal public negotiations kicked into high gear, ultimately lasting from 2013 to 2015.
Let's look at the mechanics of those negotiations, because Khamenei did not give Rouhani a blank check. The supreme leader drew very strict red lines. The Iranian negotiating team was authorized to discuss the nuclear program and absolutely nothing else.
Nothing else.
No discussions about their ballistic missile development, no talks about their human rights record, and absolutely no negotiations regarding their forward defense strategy, meaning their funding of militias like Hezbollah in Lebanon or the Houthis in Yemen.
And from the American perspective, the Obama administration accepted that limitation. The U.S. National Security Advisor at the time, Susan Rice, framed the objective very clearly. The deal was never intended to open a new era of friendly relations or solve every problem in the Middle East.
It was purely transactional.
Purely. It was a pragmatic, minimalist arms control effort designed to achieve one specific goal: make a highly dangerous country substantially less dangerous by removing its path to a nuclear weapon.
Which culminates in the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action signed in 2015. It's an incredibly dense technical document. Let's break down exactly what Iran gave up and what they got in return.
Sure. On the physical side, Iran agreed to slash its stockpile of enriched uranium by 98%. They agreed to disconnect and store thousands of their centrifuges. They committed to completely redesigning their heavy water reactor at Arak, literally physically filling the original core with concrete so it could never be used to produce weapons-grade plutonium.
Wow, filling it with concrete. That's pretty definitive.
It is. Furthermore, they agreed to implement the IAEA's additional protocol, which granted international inspectors unprecedented, highly intrusive access to monitor their entire nuclear supply chain.
And these limitations were set to last for 10 to 15 years, depending on the specific restriction. And in exchange for dismantling the physical infrastructure of a bomb, what was the reward?
The reward was survival and economic reintegration. The United Nations, the United States, and the European Union agreed to lift the sweeping economic sanctions that were tied specifically to the nuclear program. Crucially, Iran became the first country in history to successfully negotiate its way out from under UN Chapter 7 sanctions without fighting a war or experiencing regime change.
I need to pause you there because UN Chapter 7 sounds like, bureaucratic legalese. But in the world of international law, it is basically the nuclear option. What does it actually mean to be under Chapter 7?
Yeah, so the UN Charter has different chapters for how the Security Council handles disputes. Chapter 6 is essentially a sternly worded recommendation to resolve a conflict peacefully. Chapter 7 is entirely different.
How so?
When a country is placed under Chapter 7, the UN Security Council formally declares that the country is a threat to international peace and security. It makes sanctions universally, legally binding on every nation on Earth, and it legally authorizes the use of military force to ensure compliance. It completely severs a nation from the global financial and diplomatic system. Getting out from under that without a war was a monumental diplomatic triumph for Rouhani.
So when the deal was signed, the photographs of U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry and Iranian Foreign Minister Javad Zarif smiling and bantering in Geneva, it absolutely shocked Tehran. It broke a decades-old taboo against public fraternization with American officials. And the Iranian middle class was euphoric. They poured into the streets to celebrate, anticipating massive foreign investment, an end to crippling inflation, and a return to the global community. But here is the fascinating internal dynamic. Usually, a peace deal that promises billions in economic relief makes the leaders who negotiated it universally beloved. But in Iran, while the public danced, the hardline elite were absolutely terrified. Why?
Well, the terror among the hardliners was twofold. It was ideological and economic. Ideologically, the JCPOA was an existential threat. The core tenet of sacred defense is that the United States is inherently predatory and can never, under any circumstances, be trusted.
Right.
To the hardliners, signing a massive international agreement based on mutual compliance was a dangerous leap of faith that required relaxing their revolutionary vigilance. They feared the cultural infiltration that would accompany Western business deals.
Because they had only ever envisioned a narrow transactional deal, just enough sanctions relief to prevent the economy from collapsing so they could regroup and continue their resistance. But suddenly, the Iranian public is acting like this is the dawn of a new pro-Western era.
And that leads to the economic terror, which
Yeah.
is arguably even more powerful.
Yeah.
We really have to examine the political economy of the sanctions regime. Over decades of isolation, a massive, highly lucrative shadow economy had grown behind the wall of international sanctions.
And this isn't just like people smuggling flat-screen TVs across the border. We are talking about billions of dollars.
Tens of billions. These black market networks, Hawala money transfer systems, and front companies were tightly entwined with the IRGC and powerful state-linked clerics. Because regular, transparent international trade and banking were illegal, the state had to rely on these opaque networks to sell its oil and import goods.
Wow.
The IRGC essentially held a monopoly on the entire import-export sector of the country.
So lifting the sanctions means opening Iran up to transparent European trade, direct foreign investment, and international banking compliance standards like the FATF, which tracks money laundering. That transparency threatened to completely destroy the lucrative monopolies held by the IRGC. Their vast wealth and domestic power were directly tied to Iran remaining isolated.
Precisely. There was a powerful, entrenched political economy working in direct opposition to the deal's success. The hardliners couldn't openly defy Khamenei, who would ultimately approve the deal, but they launched an immediate, aggressive internal sabotage campaign against President Rouhani's administration.
Right, they start arresting dual national Iranian Americans on dubious espionage charges just to scare off foreign investors. They dramatically increase their provocative military exercises, testing ballistic missiles with "Israel must be wiped out" literally written on the side in Hebrew. They were deliberately sending a clear, unambiguous signal to the West. Do not interpret this nuclear agreement as a shift in our fundamental geopolitical hostility.
And it wasn't just the hardliners inside Iran who were furious about the JCPOA. If we look outside Iran's borders, the regional reaction was explosive. Israel and the key Arab states, specifically Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, they were aghast at what Obama had done.
Because from their perspective, the JCPOA wasn't a triumph of diplomacy, it was a strategic disaster. While Washington and European capitals celebrated avoiding a war, Jerusalem and Riyadh saw the United States entirely abandoning its traditional containment strategy against Iran.
Remember that caveat Khamenei insisted upon, that the talks could only cover the nuclear program.
Yes, the strict red lines.
The regional allies felt the consequences of that limitation intimately. Iran's forward defense strategy was expanding rapidly. Iranian-backed proxies were gaining ground in Syria, Hezbollah was entrenched in Lebanon, and the Houthis were taking over Yemen, right on Saudi Arabia's southern border.
The Arab states felt incredibly vulnerable. They watched the Obama administration openly discuss a pivot to Asia to counter China, and they interpreted it as an abandonment of the Middle East. They were terrified that lifting sanctions would simply hand Iran billions of dollars in unfrozen assets to pour directly into these proxy wars, allowing a richer, unsanctioned Iran to completely dominate the region.
Right, and this profound anxiety culminated in a highly illustrative, really tense meeting at Camp David in May 2015, just months before the JCPOA was finalized. Arab leaders traveled to the United States to demand ironclad American security guarantees. They essentially wanted formal defense pacts that would commit the U.S. military to actively containing Iranian influence.
And Obama's response, as detailed in the source text, is stunningly blunt. He flatly dismissed their calls for security guarantees. When one Arab leader complained bitterly about the threat posed by the Iranian-backed militia Hezbollah, Obama reportedly retorted that they should form their own Hezbollahs.
Yeah, it was a shocking message for allies who were used to unconditional American protection. The U.S. was perfectly willing to sell them advanced weaponry, sure, but the era of American soldiers fighting their regional proxy wars was over. Obama publicly stated that the Saudis and Iranians needed to find an effective way to share the neighborhood and institute a cold peace.
Cold peace! That phrase must have induced a panic attack in the Saudi royal court. So, if the superpower guarantor of their security is essentially telling them to handle it themselves, how do the Arab states and Israel react?
Well, they react by relying on the one thing the U.S. was still offering: hardware. They go on an unprecedented massive weapon-buying spree to build up their own conventional deterrence against Iran.
Because what else could they do?
Exactly. To mollify their anger over the nuclear deal, Washington offered its Middle Eastern allies over $100 billion in new weapons sales. By 2018, the disparity was staggering. Saudi Arabia's military budget ballooned to $75 billion. Israel's reached $15.9 billion. Meanwhile, heavily sanctioned Iran's military budget was around $6.8 billion.
I want to look at this neutrally, though. By isolating the nuclear issue and explicitly telling its regional allies they were on their own against Iran's proxies, did the United States fundamentally misread the geopolitical board?
The analysis points to a massive strategic miscalculation, yeah? The U.S. administration genuinely believed that removing the existential threat of an Iranian nuclear bomb would inherently calm the region and reduce tensions. But by ignoring the intertwined realities of the regional proxy wars, the U.S. inadvertently supercharged a massive conventional arms race and deeply alienated its closest security partners.
Which creates a truly fascinating, if chaotic, dynamic. You have furious U.S. allies in the Middle East actively lobbying lawmakers in Washington to kill the deal. And simultaneously, you have angry Iranian hardliners in Tehran actively launching missiles to sabotage the deal's economic benefits. You have extremists on both sides of the geographic divide working toward the exact same goal, the death of the JCPOA.
It's incredible.
Yeah.
That potent mix of regional alienation and internal Iranian sabotage created the perfect, fragile conditions for the deal's collapse the moment the political winds shifted in Washington.
Which brings us to the tectonic shift of 2018. Donald Trump is in the White House. Throughout his campaign, he hammered the JCPOA, calling it the worst, most one-sided deal ever negotiated. And in May 2018, despite the IAEA repeatedly confirming that Iran was fully complying with the technical limits of the agreement, Trump formally withdraws the United States. He completely shreds the deal and imposes a strategy that becomes known as maximum pressure.
And the sheer scale and velocity of this pressure campaign were staggering. Over the next 2 years, the U.S. Treasury Department basically weaponized the American financial system. The number of specific U.S. sanctions levied against Iranian entities skyrocketed from roughly 70 to over 1,500.
Over 1,500? That's insane.
Yeah, entire sectors of the Iranian economy, banking, shipping, energy, manufacturing, they were all blacklisted. Iran rapidly became the most economically sanctioned country in the history of the world.
And the expectation in Washington was remarkably confident, right? They explicitly told their skeptical European allies that the Iranian economy was a house of cards. The prevailing belief was that it would be a matter of mere months before the economic pain became so intolerable that Iran would be forced to crawl back to the negotiating table, begging for a new, more restrictive deal. Or the internal pressure would simply cause the Islamic Republic to collapse from within.
Right, but that assumption rests on the flawed physics metaphor we discussed earlier. Squeeze hard enough and the structure breaks. But human institutions, especially those forged in trauma, they don't always obey linear physics.
Yeah.
Iran absorbed the shock. They did not fold. Supreme Leader Khamenei did not view maximum pressure as a tough negotiating tactic. He viewed it as a thinly veiled strategy of regime change. He dubbed it an imposed economic war, deliberately linking it back to the sacred defense against Saddam Hussein.
And how do they actually survive it? Because the economic devastation was real, inflation soared, the currency collapsed, and foreign companies fled the country overnight. They don't just sit there and take it, do they? They mobilize a concept they call the resistance economy.
They do. The resistance economy was a massive structural pivot. It was an acknowledgement that relying on the global, Western-dominated financial system was a fatal vulnerability. So they shifted aggressively toward import substitution, ramping up local manufacturing to replace European goods.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and they supercharged the massive smuggling networks controlled by the IRGC. They began exporting electricity and gas to neighboring countries like Iraq, using convoluted barter systems or local currency swaps to completely bypass the U.S. dollar.
So while the Iranian middle class was decimated by inflation and scarcity, the regime itself found workarounds. The economy didn't experience the total free fall into oblivion that Washington had modeled. But in April 2019, the Trump administration decides that squeezing isn't enough. They want to crush. They announced that the U.S. will drive Iranian oil exports to absolute zero, aggressively ending all sanctions waivers for countries that were still buying Iranian crude, like India and China.
And that specific decision is the moment Iran flips the geopolitical script. Up until that point, despite the U.S. withdrawal, Iran had actually remained compliant with the nuclear limits of the JCPOA.
Really? They were still compliant?
Yeah, they're trying to hold the moral high ground, hoping to isolate the U.S. diplomatically and keep European trade channels open. But driving their oil exports to zero crossed a red line. It was an existential threat to the state's survival. Tehran concluded that strategic patience had failed. Pressure must be met with pressure. If the United States thought it could wage a devastating economic war without risking a physical, kinetic war, Iran was determined to disabuse them of that notion.
This is where the shadow war steps into the light. we see a rapid, highly calculated kinetic escalation. In May 2019, 4 commercial oil tankers are sabotaged with limpet mines off the coast of Fujairah in the United Arab Emirates. Why strike near the UAE? Because the Emiratis had enthusiastically supported the maximum pressure campaign. Iran was sending a message.
Your vital energy infrastructure and your gleaming tourism sectors are just 100 kilometers across the water from our missile silos. If we suffer, you will suffer.
And then a month later, the IRGC escalates further. They shoot down a highly advanced $130 million U.S. Global Hawk surveillance drone over the Strait of Hormuz. That act brought the U.S. and Iran to the absolute brink of direct war. President Trump famously authorized retaliatory airstrikes on Iranian radar installations, but called them off with planes literally in the air, citing concerns over proportional casualties. So Iran sees the U.S. hesitate, and they decide to push the envelope even further. The crescendo of this escalation comes in September 2019. It is a highly sophisticated, coordinated drone and cruise missile attack on the Abqaiq and Khurais oil processing facilities in eastern Saudi Arabia. The sheer technical execution of this attack was stunning.
It was a watershed moment in modern warfare, honestly. The Iranian drones and low-flying missiles completely bypassed billions of dollars worth of American-supplied Patriot missile defense systems.
Just totally slipped under the radar.
Yeah. The attack temporarily knocked out half of Saudi Arabia's oil production, which equated to roughly 5% of the entire global daily oil supply in a matter of minutes.
It was a masterclass in asymmetric signaling. Iran was demonstrating military capabilities that caught the Pentagon entirely by surprise. They were effectively stating, if you prevent us from exporting our oil, we have the capability and the will to ensure that no one in the Persian Gulf exports theirs. It proved that applying maximum pressure without an off-ramp could easily trigger a devastating regional conflict that would crater the global economy.
Exactly.
But let me challenge the strategy for a second. This seems like a wildly reckless gamble by Tehran. They are poking a superpower. And the U.S. responds by taking out one of the most mythic, vital figures in the Iranian military hierarchy. In January 2020, a U.S. drone strike in Baghdad assassins General Qasem Soleimani, the head of the IRGC's elite Quds force and the architect of their entire regional proxy network. Did that assassination successfully reestablish deterrence for the United States, or did it just pour gasoline on the fire?
The assassination of Soleimani did not cower the Iranian leadership. It actually caused a profound paradigm shift for Khamenei. Soleimani was essentially the second most powerful man in the country.
Yeah.
For the supreme leader, his death proved beyond any shadow of a doubt that the United States was an implacable, lethal enemy that could never be managed or negotiated with. Iran's strategic goal fundamentally expanded after that strike. It was no longer just about surviving containment or protecting their borders. The new, explicit objective of their forward defense strategy became the total expulsion of the United States military from the Middle East.
So the trust isn't just broken, it is pulverized. Iran realizes that economic pressure isn't going to stop, and military strikes are obviously on the table. So they decide that the only way to claw back leverage, the only way to force the U.S. to back off, is to aggressively accelerate the very program the U.S. is terrified of.
Which leads us to the transition of power in Washington. In 2021, President Joe Biden enters the White House. He had campaigned on the promise of returning to the JCPOA, recognizing that maximum pressure had basically failed to halt the nuclear program. But his administration adds a significant caveat.
What was it?
They state they want a longer and stronger deal. They want to reinstate the nuclear limits. But they also want to compel Iran to negotiate restrictions on their ballistic missile development and their regional proxy militias.
And to force Iran to agree to these extra highly sensitive concessions, the Biden administration decides to keep Trump's architecture of maximum pressure sanctions fully in place as leverage.
Meanwhile, the political landscape in Iran has undergone a total hardening. The moderate pragmatist Rouhani is out of office. He is deeply unpopular because the Iranian public blames him for selling them the false hope, the JCPOA, only to watch the economy crash when Trump withdrew.
Right.
So in the 2021 elections, which were heavily engineered by the Guardian Council to disqualify moderate candidates, the hardline cleric Ibrahim Raisi wins the presidency. The hardliners now enjoy absolute control over the executive branch, the legislature, and the judiciary.
And their view on returning to the 2015 deal, I'm guessing it's not favorable?
Oh, they refuse to budge. They believe that Rouhani's fatal mistake was giving up Iran's nuclear leverage far too quickly, long before the economic benefits were actually secured. They view the Biden administration's demand for a longer and stronger deal while maintaining sanctions as completely hypocritical.
So, facing maintained American pressure, The Raisi government launches its own version of maximum pressure. They begin systematically dismantling the IAEA's monitoring capabilities, ripping out the cameras that verify their stockpile. And far more dangerously, they aggressively ramp up uranium enrichment. They start enriching to 20%, and then they take the unprecedented step of enriching up to 60%.
Right.
Now, I want to dive into the physics of this for a moment because the percentages can be a bit misleading to a layperson. Like, 60% doesn't sound that close to 90%, which is weapons grade, but the effort to get there is incredibly nonlinear, isn't it?
It is, exactly. The concept is measured in separative work units, or SWU. Think of it this way. Uranium mined from the ground is almost entirely the stable isotope U-238, with less than 1% of the fissile U-235 that you actually need for a reaction.
Okay, so mostly useless rock.
Yeah, essentially. So the centrifuges have to spin the gas to separate the slightly lighter U-235 from the heavier U-238, removing the vast, overwhelming majority of the useless U-238 just to reach 4% or 5% enrichment, which is what you need for a civilian power plant, takes a massive amount of time and physical energy.
So the initial steps are basically the hardest part of the climb.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Going from that natural state up to 20% enrichment consumes roughly 90% of the total effort required to make a bomb. By the time you reach 60% enrichment, which, by the way, has absolutely no plausible civilian justification, you have completed over 95% of the necessary physical work.
Wow.
The jump from 60% to 90% weapons grade is trivial. It could be done in a matter of days or weeks using a small fraction of the centrifuges.
So the breakout time, which is the time it would take for Iran to produce enough 90% fissile material for one single nuclear weapon, shrinks dramatically. Under the JCPOA, that breakout time was kept at roughly 1 year, giving the international community plenty of time to intervene. Under Raisi, as they deploy thousands of advanced, highly efficient second-generation centrifuges, that breakout time collapses to mere weeks.
Yes. And while this aggressive enrichment campaign is happening out in the open, there is a brutal, covert shadow war raging in the background. The United States and Israel, desperate to slow the timeline down, resort to kinetic sabotage.
We see a wave of mysterious incidents. Major cyber attacks take down the electricity grids feeding the centrifuge halls. There are highly coordinated assassinations of top Iranian nuclear scientists. There are massive unexplained explosions that gut the advanced centrifuge assembly facilities at Natanz and Karaj.
But the remarkable takeaway from the source material is that these acts of extreme sabotage do not deter Tehran. In fact, the effect was the exact opposite of what the saboteurs intended.
It just made them madder.
Yeah. Every time a facility was bombed or a power grid was hacked, Iran used it as a justification to retaliate by rebuilding the damaged facilities quicker, often burying them deeper underground beneath mountains where bunker-buster bombs couldn't reach them, and installing even more advanced centrifuges.
Let me synthesize what this means for you listening, because the visual is striking. It's as if Iran is building a highly lethal weapon right on the kitchen table. They are manufacturing the explosive lenses, they are refining the core, they are wiring the detonator, and they are doing it in plain sight. But they deliberately leave the very final screw untightened just so they can point to it and say, technically, under the definitions of international law, this is not a weapon yet. How do they operate with this extreme level of brinkmanship without triggering a preemptive, full-scale military strike from the U.S. or Israel?
Well, they felt emboldened to take this incredible existential risk because the hardliners genuinely believed they had constructed a new, powerful safety net to replace the West. They believed they had successfully outmaneuvered American containment by pivoting their entire grand strategy toward a look-east policy.
This is a critical ideological shift. Khamenei decides that the entire concept of economic integration with Europe and the United States is basically a trap. It just creates dependencies that make Iran vulnerable to future sanctions. So he aggressively courts the East, specifically Russia and China. The hardliners in Tehran begin dreaming of a grand tripartite alliance, an axis of resistance comprising Moscow, Beijing, and Tehran that will finally possess the economic and military gravity to destroy American global hegemony.
But this is where the geopolitical reality completely crashes into ideological fantasy. The source text makes it abundantly clear that Iran read way, way too much into this convergence of interests.
They saw an ideological brotherhood where none actually existed.
Precisely. Let's look at the actual dynamics. It is true that Russia and Iran grew significantly closer in military terms. They cooperated deeply to save the Assad regime during the Syrian civil war, and later Iran became a vital supplier of suicide drones and ammunition to fuel Russia's grinding war in Ukraine. But China's perspective on Iran was fundamentally different.
How so?
China did not view the Islamic Republic as an ideological brother-in-arms in a grand holy war against Western imperialism. To Beijing, Iran was simply a transactional economic asset, a useful node for its massive Belt and Road initiative.
I mean, Iran is incredibly rich in energy and minerals, and because it is cut off from Western markets, it has no leverage. It is forced to sell its oil to China at steep discounts. From Beijing's perspective, Iran is just a very convenient, cheap gas station that happens to irritate Washington. There was grand rhetoric in Tehran about a 25-year strategic partnership with hundreds of billions in Chinese investment, but the reality was far colder.
The starkest illustration of this disparity occurred in December 2022. It was a diplomatic slap in the face that shattered the illusion of the Eastern Axis. Chinese President Xi Jinping embarked on a highly publicized visit to the Middle East. But he didn't go to Tehran. He went to Riyadh, Saudi Arabia.
Because Saudi Arabia, not Iran, is China's largest and most reliable energy supplier.
Exactly. And while in Riyadh, Xi Jinping signed sweeping joint statements with the Gulf Arab leaders. These statements didn't just focus on trade. They explicitly demanded that Iran fully cooperate with international nuclear watchdogs. They demanded Iran stop interfering in the internal affairs of regional states, and most insultingly to Iranian nationalism, the statement even questioned Iran's sovereign claims over 3 disputed islands in the Persian Gulf.
That must have caused absolute whiplash in Tehran. You build your entire grand strategy around China being your great protector against the West, and their leader goes to the capital of your greatest regional rival and signs a document validating all of their talking points.
It was a brutal wake-up call. It demonstrated that China's overriding interest in the Middle East is the stability of its energy markets and securing massive construction contracts with the wealthy Gulf monarchies. China has no interest in financing Iran's revolutionary proxy wars if those wars threaten the flow of oil to Beijing.
That makes sense.
In fact, China used its immense economic leverage as Iran's sole major buyer of oil to force Tehran to curb its forward defense strategy. In early 2023, Beijing successfully brokered a diplomatic detente between Iran and Saudi Arabia, effectively telling Tehran to cool down the regional tensions if they wanted Chinese money to keep flowing.
And what about the other pillar of this supposed alliance? Russia was supposed to be the military shield, the great superpower that would provide advanced fighter jets and air defense systems to protect Iran's nuclear sites.
Russia's disastrous, protracted performance in the Ukraine war severely diminished its utility as a strategic shield. The Russian military was bogged down, burning through its own stockpiles, heavily sanctioned itself, and structurally weakened. Instead of Russia acting as the powerful patron protecting Iran, Moscow was coming to Tehran as a supplicant, asking for basic munitions and drones to sustain its own war effort.
Let's follow the logic of the hardliners here. They realize that international agreements with the West are fragile, easily torn up, and fundamentally untrustworthy. Then they realize that their new Eastern allies, China and Russia, are entirely self-interested, transactional, and will not unconditionally protect them in a crisis. Where does that leave a regime obsessed with survival? It leads to a chilling final conclusion regarding national security.
Which brings us to the present day, the mid-2020s, and what the source describes as the new normal. The trauma of the 1980s Iran-Iraq War has now been successfully and completely mapped onto the trauma of the maximum pressure years.
The lesson is the same.
Yes. The lesson the current leadership has internalized is identical. Iran is completely alone, the world order is inherently hostile, international law is a fiction designed to constrain them, and survival demands absolute self-reliance and the aggressive projection of power.
And the regional dynamic fundamentally shifts again with the outbreak of the massive war in Gaza.
Yes. The detente with Saudi Arabia somewhat neutralized the Gulf threat, but Israel fully replaces the Arab states as Iran's absolute primary existential regional adversary. Iran no longer views Israel merely through the ideological lens of the Palestinian issue. They view Israel as a technologically advanced great power rival backed to the hilt by the United States that is actively aiming for total regional supremacy and the dismantling of Iran's proxy network.
This brings us to the climax of this entire decades-long saga. We see unprecedented escalation. Israel launches direct, decapitating strikes on senior IRGC commanders in diplomatic compounds in Syria. They launch massive, devastating campaigns against Iran's most prized and powerful proxy, Hezbollah, in Lebanon. Iran responds with direct ballistic missile barrages from its own soil into Israeli territory. And in the midst of this explosive regional war, Iran begins signaling a willingness to do the absolute unthinkable.
Right. Iranian officials, including senior advisors to the supreme leader, begin publicly stating that if the existence of the Islamic Republic is threatened by Israeli or American military strikes, they are prepared to fundamentally alter their nuclear doctrine. They begin signaling that Khamenei's long-standing religious fatwa against building nuclear weapons is not a permanent immutable law, but a strategic posture that can be reversed if necessary.
Let me stop and unpack the sheer gravity of this for you. They are explicitly telling the world that to protect their network of regional proxies and to guarantee the survival of their own regime against direct military strikes, the ultimate taboo is now officially on the table. They are standing at the threshold with that final screw in their hand, looking at the West and saying, "Push us, and we will turn it." Are we looking at a permanent, unending state of nuclear brinkmanship?
We are looking at a fundamentally altered strategic landscape, where the nuclear program is no longer viewed as a bargaining chip that can be traded away for economic relief or integration into the global market. In the minds of the hardliners who now possess total control over every lever of power in Tehran, the advanced nuclear infrastructure is the absolute core of the regime's survival strategy.
So it's not a chip anymore, it's the whole table.
Exactly. Nuclear threshold capability is seen not as a substitute for their proxy militias, but as the ultimate untouchable umbrella necessary to protect those proxies, deter American intervention, and cement Iran's position as an unassailable regional hegemon.
Synthesizing this incredible, complex journey we've been on today, we started in the 1980s with a terrified nation, reeling from the horrors of chemical weapon attacks, realizing that the international community would happily watch them suffocate. We watched them desperately try to use a secret centrifuge program as a massive bargaining chip to buy their way out of crushing economic isolation with the 2015 JCPOA. And we saw how the shredding of that diplomatic agreement, followed by the application of brutal, unrelenting maximum pressure, forged a hardened, completely sanctioned state. A state that is now using near-weapons-grade uranium enrichment not to generate electricity, but as a heavily fortified geopolitical shield.
It is the perfect historical case study, illustrating exactly why linear thinking and brute force calculations so often fail spectacularly in the realm of foreign policy.
Why does all of this matter to you? Because it demonstrates how applying immense, overwhelming pressure to a nation, trying to squeeze it until it breaks, doesn't always result in surrender. Sometimes that intense pressure fundamentally reshapes the nation's DNA. In this case, it completely destroyed the moderate, pragmatic political factions within Iran. It empowered and entrenched the most militant, paranoid hardliners. And it ultimately created a far more unpredictable, heavily armed, and deeply hardened adversary than the one the West originally set out to contain.
The strategic pressure cooker did not explode and destroy the regime. The heat and isolation forged a much harder, more dangerous metal.
Which brings us to a final, provocative thought I want to leave you with. Something to mull over on your own as you watch the news out of the Middle East. Throughout this deep dive, we've extensively analyzed the psychology of older men whose entire worldviews were forged in the fires of the 1979 revolution and the brutal, visceral trauma of the Iran-Iraq War. But demographics are destiny. What happens to this massive, highly advanced, near-weapons-grade nuclear infrastructure when a new generation of Iranians inevitably takes the reins of power? We are talking about a... Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the simple, linear narratives behind the headlines, because as we've seen today, the reality of global politics is always infinitely more complex and surprising. We'll see you next time.